The scream of the wind had become so constant that Thomas Garrett no longer heard it as sound, but felt it as a living thing trying to tear the flesh from his bones. He urged his horse forward through the blinding white, squinting against snow that felt like tiny knives against his exposed skin when he saw what looked like a dark mound half buried in the drift ahead. His heart lurched when he realized it was a person, a woman in a torn burgundy dress, her dark hair matted with ice and snow, her lips already turning blue. Thomas threw himself from his horse and dropped to his knees beside her, his gloved hands shaking as he pressed fingers to her throat. A pulse, faint but there. Thank God. He did not waste time wondering how she had come to be here in the mountains above Calistoga, California, in the worst blizzard of 1878 that anyone could remember. He stripped off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her frozen body, then lifted her into his arms. She was light, too light, and completely limp. Her head lolled against his chest as he struggled back to his horse. Getting her onto the saddle while the animal danced nervously in the storm took every ounce of strength he possessed. He climbed up behind her and pulled her back against his chest, wrapping one arm around her waist while the other held the reins. His cabin was only another mile, but in this weather it might as well have been 10. He kicked his horse forward and prayed. The journey back felt eternal. Thomas talked to the woman constantly, though she gave no response, her body a dead weight against him. He told her to hold on, told her she would be all right, told her his name and that he would not let her die. The wind stole his words, but he kept talking anyway, as if the sound of his voice alone could tether her to life. When his cabin finally materialized through the white curtain of snow, relief flooded through him so powerfully that his eyes stung. He half fell from his horse, pulling her down with him, and kicked open his front door. The fire he had banked before leaving had died to embers, and the cabin was barely warmer than outside. He laid her on his bed and immediately set to work building up the fire, throwing on log after log until flames roared in the stone hearth. Only then did he turn his full attention to the woman. Her clothes were soaked through and frozen in places. He knew he had to get her out of them, and the impropriety of it barely registered against the urgency of saving her life. His hands were clumsy with cold as he worked at the buttons of her dress, finally giving up and using his knife to cut through the fabric. Underneath, she wore a thin chemise and petticoat, equally soaked. He stripped those away too, trying not to look more than necessary, though he could not help noticing the ugly bruises on her ribs and arms. Someone had hurt her. He wrapped her in every blanket he owned and pulled her close to the fire, then heated water and tried to get some between her lips. Most of it ran down her chin. Her skin was like ice, her breathing so shallow he had to press his ear to her mouth to confirm she still drew breath at all. Thomas had seen men die from cold during his years in the mountains. He knew the signs. This woman was hovering on the edge. He made a decision that would have scandalized anyone who knew, but there was no one here to see, and he cared only about keeping her alive. He stripped off his own wet clothes down to his union suit, then climbed into the bed and pulled her against him, wrapping his body around hers, sharing his warmth. She was so cold that at first it felt like holding a block of ice, but gradually, so gradually, he began to feel her skin warm beneath his touch. "Please," he whispered against her hair. "Please wake up. Do not die. Not here. Not like this." He prayed then, words he hadn't spoken since he was a boy in his mother's house back in Missouri. He prayed to a God he was not sure listened anymore, prayed with a desperation that surprised him. He had been alone in these mountains for 3 years, ever since his brother's death, and he had grown accustomed to solitude, had even come to prefer it. But holding this unknown woman, feeling her fragile life flickering against him, something in his chest cracked open. The storm raged outside for the rest of that day and into the night. Thomas did not leave the bed, except to add wood to the fire. He held the woman and willed his heat into her body and listened to her breathing, each shallow breath a small victory. As darkness fell, he managed to get a few spoonfuls of warm broth between her lips and this time she swallowed reflexively. Hope kindled in his chest. Near midnight, her breathing changed. It deepened, became more regular. The deathly pallor began to fade from her cheeks, replaced by a faint hint of color. Thomas felt tears prick his eyes and did not bother to hide them, though there was no one to see. She was going to live. He did not know how he knew, but he was certain of it. He must have fallen asleep eventually, because he woke to pale gray light filtering through his cabin's single window and the sensation of someone watching him. He opened his eyes to find the woman awake, her gaze fixed on his face. Her eyes were a remarkable shade of hazel, green, and gold, and brown, all mixed together. They were wide with confusion and fear. "Easy," Thomas said softly, not moving. "You are safe. I found you in the snow yesterday. You were near frozen to death." She tried to speak, but only a croak emerged. He reached for the water he had left by the bed and carefully helped her drink. She took a few sips, winced, then tried again. "Where am I?" Her voice was barely a whisper, rough and broken. "My cabin, about 6 miles outside Calistoga. I am Thomas Garrett. I was heading home from checking my traps when I found you." Her brow furrowed as she tried to process this. Then her eyes widened as she seemed to become aware of their situation, the fact that they were pressed together with very little between them. Thomas saw panic flash across her face. "I apologize for the liberties," he said quickly, starting to pull away. "You were freezing. I had to warm you. Your clothes were soaked. I did not look more than I had to. I swear it." To his surprise, she caught his arm weakly. "Do not apologize. You saved my life." A shudder ran through her. "I remember the cold. I thought I was going to die." "What is your name?" Thomas asked gently. "What were you doing out there?" Pain flickered across her face, and for a moment he thought she might cry. "My name is Margaret Zimmerman. I was running from my husband." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and complicated. Thomas felt something sink in his chest. Of course she was married. But even as the thought formed, he saw her left hand bore no ring, and the bruises on her arms took on new, darker meaning. "He is not a good man," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "He brought me to California 6 months ago, said we would start fresh. But it only got worse. Yesterday he came home drunk, and I knew from the look in his eyes that this time he might actually kill me. So I ran. I took one of the horses and I ran. I did not even know where I was going. I just ran." "And the storm caught you," Thomas finished. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "The horse threw me somewhere in the mountains. I tried to keep going, but I could not feel my feet anymore. I could not feel anything. I just wanted to lie down." She looked at him with those remarkable eyes. "You should have left me there." "No," Thomas said firmly. "No, I could never have done that. He will come looking for me. When the storm clears, he will come. And when he finds me, he will kill me. And he might kill you too for helping me." Thomas sat up fully now, his jaw set. "Let him come. I am not afraid of your husband, Margaret. You do not know him. You do not know what he is capable of." "I know what he has already done." Thomas gestured to her bruised arms. "A man who would beat a woman is a coward, and I have dealt with cowards before." Margaret studied his face for a long moment. "Why are you helping me? You do not even know me." It was a fair question, and Thomas found he did not have a simple answer. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because no one deserves to die alone in the snow. And because—" He hesitated, then continued. "Because I have been alone in these mountains for 3 years, and I think maybe I forgot what it meant to be human until I saw you lying there, in that drift." Something shifted in Margaret's expression. She reached out tentatively and touched his hand. Thank you, Thomas Garrett. Whatever happens, thank you. The storm continued for 2 more days. Margaret was too weak to leave the bed for the first day, so Thomas cared for her with a gentleness that surprised them both. He made her broth and tea, helped her drink, kept the fire burning. When she finally felt strong enough to sit up, he gave her one of his flannel shirts and a pair of his trousers, both of which were far too large but at least dry and warm. He watched as she moved carefully to the chair by the fire, wincing with each step. Your ribs, he observed. Are they broken? I do not think so. Just bruised. She lowered herself into the chair and pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Everything hurts. Thomas busied himself making coffee, trying not to stare at her. Even in his oversized clothes, with her hair tangled and her face still bearing the marks of her ordeal, she was beautiful, more than beautiful. There was a strength in her eyes, a determination that the brutality she had suffered had not quite extinguished. Tell me about yourself, Margaret said suddenly. You said you have been alone here for 3 years? Thomas poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed her one. Yes, my brother and I came out here together in 1872 during the gold rush. We had a claim about 10 miles north of here. It did not amount to much, but we made enough to get by. Then 3 years ago, there was an accident in one of the deeper tunnels. A collapse. Samuel was killed. I am so sorry. He nodded, staring into his coffee. I sold the claim after that. Could not bear to work it anymore. But I did not want to leave California either. So I came here, built this cabin, started trapping. It is a solitary life, but I thought that was what I wanted. And now? Margaret asked softly. Thomas looked up and met her eyes. Now I am not so sure. They talked for hours that day, the storm howling outside while the fire crackled between them. Margaret told him about growing up in Boston, the daughter of a shopkeeper. She had married Ethan Zimmerman when she was 19, fooled by his charm and his promises. The first time he hit her was on their wedding night, and it had only escalated from there. When he announced they were moving to California, she had hoped distance from his drinking companions might change him. Instead, it only isolated her further. I should have left him years ago, she said, her voice thick with regret. But I had nowhere to go, no money of my own. My father died 2 years ago, and my mother passed when I was a girl. I have a sister in Philadelphia, but I have not heard from her in years. I felt trapped. You are not trapped anymore, Thomas said. You are here and you are alive. That is what matters. But for how long? Ethan will not give up. He considers me his property. He told me once that if I ever tried to leave, he would hunt me down no matter how long it took. Then we will be ready for him, Thomas said with a calm certainty. And in the meantime, you will stay here until you are strong enough to decide what you want to do next. I have enough supplies to last the winter, and then some. Margaret looked at him with wonder. You would do that for me? Let me stay here with you? It would hardly be a hardship, Thomas admitted, then felt heat rise in his cheeks. I mean, it is no trouble. The cabin is small, but there is room enough. A smile tugged at Margaret's lips, the first real smile he had seen from her. It transformed her face, made her eyes light up. I think I understand what you mean, Thomas Garrett. The storm broke on the 3rd day, leaving the world outside blanketed in pristine white. The sun emerged brilliant and blinding, and the temperature dropped even further. Thomas ventured out to check on his horse and bring in more firewood, leaving Margaret by the fire with strict instructions to rest. When he returned an hour later, his arms loaded with split logs, he found her standing at the window, staring out at the mountains. Beautiful, is it not? He said, setting down the wood. Terrifying, she corrected. To think I was out there in that, if you had not found me. But I did find you, Thomas said, coming to stand beside her. And you are here now, safe. She turned to look at him, and he was struck again by how close they stood. He could see flecks of gold in her eyes, could smell the faint scent of the soap he had given her to wash with. His heart began to pound in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. Thomas, she said softly, I need you to understand something. I am still married. In the eyes of the law and God, I belong to another man. You do not belong to anyone, Thomas said fiercely. You are your own person, Margaret. Perhaps, but that does not change the facts. If I stay here with you, people will talk. And if Ethan finds me here, he could make trouble for you. Real trouble. I already told you I am not afraid of him. But I am afraid for you. She placed her hand on his chest, and he felt the heat of it through his shirt. You are a good man, Thomas. Better than any I have known. I will not let you suffer because of me. Thomas covered her hand with his own. Then we will face whatever comes together. But I will not send you away, Margaret. Not now, not ever if you do not wish to go. She searched his face, and whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her. All right, she whispered. Together then. The days that followed fell into an easy rhythm. Margaret grew stronger, and though she still moved carefully, favoring her bruised ribs, she insisted on helping with the daily tasks. She cooked while Thomas hunted and tended his trap lines. She mended his worn clothing while he repaired a leak in the cabin roof. They talked endlessly, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes, their fears. Thomas found himself laughing more in those weeks than he had in the past 3 years combined. He also found himself falling in love, though he tried to deny it at first. It felt wrong somehow to harbor such feelings for a woman who was technically another man's wife. But he could not help the way his heart lifted whenever she smiled at him, or the way he lay awake at night, listening to her breathing from the other side of the cabin where she slept on a pallet he had made up. He wanted to protect her, care for her, make her happy. He wanted things he had no right to want. Margaret seemed to sense the shift in him, though she did not speak of it directly. But sometimes he would catch her watching him with an expression he could not quite read, something soft and wondering and afraid all at once. Once, when he returned from checking his traps, she greeted him at the door and helped him out of his coat, and her hands lingered on his shoulders just a moment longer than necessary. The air between them felt charged, alive with possibility and danger. January gave way to February. The snow remained deep, and travel to town was still difficult, which suited Thomas fine. He was in no hurry to share Margaret with the world, but he knew their isolation could not last forever. Eventually, supplies would run low. Eventually, the weather would break. And eventually, Ethan Zimmerman might come looking for his wife. That day came on a bright, cold morning in mid-February. Thomas had just returned from checking his northern trap line when he saw the horse tied outside his cabin. Not his own horse, which was in the small shelter he had built, but a large bay gelding he did not recognize. His blood went cold. He approached the cabin slowly, his rifle ready. Through the window he could see 2 figures inside. Margaret stood pressed against the far wall, her face pale. A large man in a dark coat stood between her and the door. Even from outside, Thomas could see the rage in his posture. Thomas kicked open the door and leveled his rifle at the man's chest. "Step away from her!" The man turned, and Thomas saw a face twisted with anger and something uglier. Ethan Zimmerman was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick-armed, with a brutal jaw and cold eyes. He looked at Thomas with contempt. "Who the hell are you?" "The man telling you to step away from her," Thomas repeated, his voice deadly calm. "Now." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "This is my wife. My business. You have no right to interfere." "She stopped being your business the moment you raised your hand to her," Thomas said. "Margaret, come here." Margaret moved quickly, ducking around Ethan and coming to stand behind Thomas. He could feel her trembling, but also felt the way she straightened her spine, refusing to cower completely. Pride surged through him. Ethan's face darkened. You are making a mistake, friend. That woman is mine by law. I have every right to take her home. She is not going anywhere with you, Thomas said flatly. Not now. Not ever. You think you can stop me? Ethan took a step forward. You think you can steal another man's wife and face no consequences? I did not steal anything. Margaret chose to leave you. She chose to stay here. That is her right. She has no rights, Ethan spat. She is my wife. She does what I say. Thomas felt rage building in his chest, hot and dangerous. Get out of my cabin now, before I do something we will both regret. Ethan studied him for a long moment, weighing his options. Thomas could see him calculating, trying to determine if he could take him. The rifle in Thomas's hands apparently tipped the scales, because Ethan finally stepped back. This is not over, he said, pointing at Margaret. You hear me, woman? You are my wife. I will be back for you. No, Margaret said, her voice surprisingly strong. I am not going back to you, Ethan. I would rather die. Something dangerous flashed in Ethan's eyes. That can be arranged. Thomas took a threatening step forward, and Ethan backed toward the door. Get out, and if you come back here, I will not hesitate to use this rifle. That is not a threat. That is a promise. Ethan glared at them both, then spat on the floor before stalking out. They heard him mount his horse and ride away, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. Only then did Thomas lower his rifle and turn to Margaret. She collapsed into his arms, her whole body shaking. Thomas held her tightly, feeling rage and fear, and something fiercely protective surged through him. He found me, she whispered against his chest. How did he find me? It does not matter. He is gone now. But he will come back. You heard him. He will come back and he will kill you, Thomas. He will kill you, and then he will take me back and I will never escape him. Thomas pulled back and gripped her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. Listen to me, Margaret. I will not let him hurt you. I will not let him take you. Do you understand? I will protect you no matter what it takes. But you cannot fight him alone, she said desperately. He is dangerous, Thomas. He has killed men before. I heard him bragging about it once, about shooting a man during a card game in Sacramento. Thomas's mind raced. She was right that he could not simply wait for Ethan to return. The man had found them once. He would find them again. They needed help, needed the protection of law and community, which meant they needed to go to town. We are going to Calistoga, he said decisively. Today, right now. We will talk to the sheriff, tell him what happened. There must be some legal recourse, some way to protect you. But I am still married to him, Margaret said miserably. The law is on his side, Thomas. A man is entitled to his wife. Not when he beats her. Not when he threatens to kill her. There has to be something we can do. They packed quickly, taking only what they could carry. Thomas saddled his horse and helped Margaret up, then climbed up behind her. As they rode down the mountain toward Calistoga, he kept his rifle across his lap and his eyes on the surrounding trees, but they saw no sign of Ethan. Calistoga was a small town nestled in the valley, known more for its hot springs than for any significant commerce. Thomas had been there only a handful of times since building his cabin, usually to buy supplies he could not trap or make himself. He headed straight for the sheriff's office, a small building at the end of the main street. Sheriff William Dawson was a weathered man in his 50s with keen eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He listened carefully as Thomas and Margaret told their story, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. When they finished, he sat back in his chair and sighed. I am not going to lie to you, Miss Zimmerman, he said. The law is not on your side here. You are married to this man. Unless we can prove he is an immediate danger to your life, there is not much I can do to stop him from taking you back. But you saw the bruises, Thomas protested. You can see what he has done to her. I see them. And if he lays a hand on her here in my town, I will arrest him for assault. But as for stopping him from claiming his wife, Dawson shook his head. My hands are tied. Margaret made a sound of despair, and Thomas felt his own hope crumbling. But the sheriff held up a hand. Now, I did not say there was nothing we could do, just that the law is limited. But there are other options. He leaned forward. First, you could leave town, head to San Francisco or even back east. Put enough distance between you that he cannot find you. I will not run again, Margaret said quietly but firmly. I am tired of running. I am tired of being afraid. Dawson nodded approvingly. Good. Then here is what I suggest. You stay here in Calistoga, where there are witnesses and law. Thomas, you can rent a room at the boarding house for Margaret. Keep her in public places as much as possible. If this Ethan fellow shows up and causes trouble, I can arrest him for disturbing the peace. And in the meantime, we work on getting you a legal separation or even a divorce. It will take time and money, but it can be done. A divorce, Margaret breathed. I never thought, is it really possible? It is not common, and it is not easy, Dawson admitted. But California law does allow for divorce on grounds of extreme cruelty. With the right lawyer and the right testimony, we could make it stick. I know a man in San Francisco who handles such cases. I can wire him if you would like. Thomas felt hope rekindling. Do it. Whatever it costs, we will find a way to pay. Dawson looked between them, and a knowing expression crossed his face. You two are not married, I take it. Thomas felt his face heat. No, sir, but I intend to change that if Margaret will have me. Once she is free. Margaret's head whipped around to stare at him, her eyes wide. Thomas met her gaze steadily. I know it is too soon, he said. I know we have only known each other for a few weeks. But Margaret, I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. I want to marry you, protect you, spend the rest of my life with you. If you will have me. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Thomas, I cannot ask you to tie yourself to me. I come with so much trouble, so much baggage. I am not asking you to ask, Thomas said gently. I am offering, freely, because I love you. I love you too, she whispered. I think I have from almost the beginning, but I was so afraid to say it, afraid it was wrong. Dawson cleared his throat loudly. Well, this is all very romantic, but let us focus on keeping you both alive first. Margaret, I will get you set up at the boarding house. Thomas, you can stay there too if you like, or return to your cabin, but I want you both to stay alert. If this Ethan fellow is as dangerous as you say, he will not take kindly to being defied. They took the sheriff's advice. Thomas rented 2 rooms at the boarding house, one for Margaret and one for himself, though he spent most of his time in hers, talking and planning and simply being together. He also hired a lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Patricia Hartwell, who had recently moved to Calistoga from San Francisco and who specialized in divorce cases. It will take at least 6 months, Mrs. Hartwell told them during their first meeting. Possibly longer. The courts move slowly, and your husband will likely contest the proceedings. But with your testimony and the physical evidence of abuse, I believe we have a strong case. 6 months felt like a lifetime, but Margaret seemed lighter than she had since Thomas found her. Having a plan, having hope, seemed to restore something in her that Ethan had nearly broken. Thomas returned to his cabin occasionally to check on it and maintain his trap lines, but he never stayed away from Calistoga for more than a day or two. He could not bear to be separated from Margaret, and he worried constantly about her safety. Though Ethan had not returned, Thomas knew it was only a matter of time. That time came 3 weeks after their initial visit to the sheriff. Thomas had gone back to his cabin to retrieve more of his belongings, planning to essentially move to town for the duration of the legal proceedings. When he returned to Calistoga just after sunset, he found a crowd gathered outside the boarding house and the sheriff standing on the porch. Terror seized him. Margaret, he choked out, pushing through the crowd. Where is Margaret? She is all right, Dawson said quickly, holding up his hands. She is inside, shaken but unhurt. Relief made Thomas's knees weak. What happened? Your friend Ethan showed up about an hour ago, drunk and angry, tried to force his way into her room. Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house owner, blocked the stairs and threatened him with a shotgun. He got aggressive and I arrested him. He is cooling off in a cell right now. Thomas bounded up the stairs and into the boarding house. He found Margaret in the parlor, surrounded by several concerned women. When she saw him, she leapt up and ran to him, and he caught her in his arms. I am all right, she said quickly, though he could feel her trembling. He did not touch me. Mrs. Patterson protected me. Thomas looked over at the stern-faced woman who ran the boarding house and nodded his gratitude. Thank you, madam. I am in your debt. No debt, Mrs. Patterson said briskly. I will not tolerate any man threatening a woman under my roof. Margaret is welcome here as long as she needs. Over the following days, the story spread through Calistoga. Public opinion, it turned out, was firmly on Margaret's side. The townspeople had seen Ethan's drunken rage, had heard his threats. When he was brought before the judge for his behavior, he was fined heavily and warned that any further disturbance would result in jail time. But the judge also made clear that legally, Margaret was still Ethan's wife, and he had a right to see her and petition her to return home. The divorce proceedings would take months, and until then, the situation remained precarious. Ethan left town after his release, but everyone knew he would be back. He had taken a room at a saloon about 10 miles away and was apparently drinking heavily and talking loudly about his unfaithful wife and the man who had stolen her. Thomas knew it was only a matter of time before the situation came to a head. What he did not expect was for Ethan to change tactics. Instead of confronting them directly, Ethan began spreading rumors. He told anyone who would listen that Margaret had abandoned him for another man, that she was an adulteress and a liar. He claimed her injuries were from a fall, not from his fists. He painted himself as the wronged husband and Thomas as a homewrecker. Some people believed him, especially those who held traditional views about marriage and a wife's duty. Thomas began to notice hostile looks when he walked through town. Someone threw a rock through the window of his boarding house room. Margaret was refused service at the general store by the owner's wife. We should leave, Margaret said one evening as they sat together in her room. Go to San Francisco or somewhere else. Start over. No, Thomas said firmly. We are not running. We are going to see this through. The people who matter know the truth. The rest will come around eventually. But privately, Thomas was worried. The hostility was making life difficult, and he knew it was wearing on Margaret. She had been through so much already. How much more could she endure? The answer came in an unexpected form. One Sunday morning, Margaret decided to attend church services. Thomas accompanied her, despite the stares and whispers. The preacher, Reverend Samuel Morse, was an elderly man with kind eyes and a reputation for fairness. His sermon that morning was about the Good Samaritan, about showing compassion to those in need regardless of what society thought. Afterward, as the congregation filed out, Reverend Morse asked to speak with Thomas and Margaret privately. They followed him into his small office, both nervous about what he might say. I have heard the rumors, the Reverend began without preamble, about both of you, and I have watched how this town has treated you these past weeks. Thomas braced himself for a lecture about sin and propriety, but instead the Reverend surprised him. I have also spoken with Sheriff Dawson and with Mrs. Patterson. I have heard the full story, not just the gossip, and I want you both to know that you have my support. Margaret gasped. Truly, truly, the Reverend said. I have been a man of God for 40 years, and I have seen many marriages. Some are holy unions blessed by love and mutual respect. Others are chains that bind women to cruelty and suffering. I believe God intends the former, not the latter. What your husband did to you, Mrs. Zimmerman, was a sin. Your choosing to save your own life was not. Tears streamed down Margaret's face. Thank you, Reverend. You do not know what it means to hear you say that. And you, Mr. Garrett, the Reverend continued, turning to Thomas, you acted with Christian charity when you saved this woman's life. The fact that love has grown between you is not something to be ashamed of. The heart wants what it wants, and I believe God works through love, not against it. The Reverend's public support began to shift opinion in town. Others came forward to defend Margaret, women who had seen their own friends or relatives trapped in abusive marriages, men who believed a woman had the right to leave a man who hurt her. The tide began to turn, but Ethan was not finished. In late March, word came that he had hired his own lawyer and was filing a countersuit, claiming that Margaret had stolen money and property from him when she left. It was a lie, but it complicated the divorce proceedings and meant more delays, more uncertainty. He is trying to drag this out, Mrs. Hartwell explained during a meeting in her office, hoping you will give up or run out of money for legal fees. It is a common tactic. We will not give up, Thomas said firmly. He had sold most of his furs and some of his trapping equipment to pay for the lawyer, and he would sell more if he had to. We will see this through. Spring came to California, bringing warmer weather and wildflowers to the valley. Thomas and Margaret took long walks together through the countryside, always staying close to town where they felt safer. They talked about the future they hoped to have together, the life they would build once she was truly free. I want a home, Margaret said one day, as they sat by a creek, watching the water rush past. A real home, not just a place to hide. I want a garden and a porch where I can sit in the evenings. I want to wake up each morning without fear. You will have all of that, Thomas promised. I will build you the finest house I can manage. It might not be fancy, but it will be ours. I do not need fancy, Margaret said, leaning her head on his shoulder. I just need you. They shared their first real kiss that day, tentative and sweet and full of promise. Thomas felt something settle in his chest, a certainty that this was right, that Margaret was the woman he was meant to find, even if the circumstances had been tragic. But their happiness was shadowed by the ongoing legal battle. The divorce proceedings dragged on through spring and into summer. Depositions were taken, evidence presented, arguments made and countered. Ethan showed up to every hearing, glaring at them from across the courtroom, his presence a constant threat. In July, things came to a head in a way none of them expected. Thomas and Margaret were walking back to the boarding house after dinner at the hotel when Ethan stepped out of an alley ahead of them. He was drunk, swaying on his feet, and he had a gun in his hand. I am done playing games, Ethan slurred. You are coming with me, Margaret. Right now. Thomas stepped in front of her, his hand moving to his own gun. Put the weapon down, Ethan. You do not want to do this. Do not tell me what I want, Ethan snarled. She is my wife, mine, and you stole her from me. I did not steal anyone. Margaret chose to leave you. That was her choice. She does not get to choose, Ethan roared. I am her husband. She does what I say. People were beginning to emerge from nearby buildings, drawn by the shouting. Thomas saw Sheriff Dawson running down the street toward them, but he was still 100 yards away. Too far to help if Ethan decided to shoot. Listen to me, Thomas said, keeping his voice calm despite the fear pounding in his chest. You can walk away right now. Put the gun down and walk away. No one has to get hurt. You are right, Ethan said, and his voice dropped to something cold and dead. No one has to get hurt except you. He raised the gun, pointing it directly at Thomas's chest. Thomas heard Margaret scream his name. He started to draw his own weapon, knowing he was too slow. The shot rang out, echoing off the buildings. Thomas flinched, expecting pain, expecting to fall, but he felt nothing. Instead, it was Ethan who staggered, his gun falling from his hand. He looked down at the red stain spreading across his shirt, then up at Thomas with confused eyes. Then he collapsed. Sheriff Dawson ran past Thomas, his own gun smoking in his hand. He kicked Ethan's weapon away and knelt beside him, checking for a pulse. After a moment, he looked up and shook his head. He is gone. Thomas stood frozen, trying to process what had just happened. Margaret grabbed his arm, pulling him around to face her. Are you hurt? Thomas, are you hurt? No, he managed. No, I am all right. He did not shoot. The sheriff. He looked at Dawson, who was standing now, his face grim. I saw him raise his weapon, the sheriff said. I had no choice. He was going to kill you. The town erupted in chaos after that. An inquest was held, and Sheriff Dawson was cleared of any wrongdoing, ruled to have acted in defense of another's life. But Ethan's death changed everything. Margaret was no longer seeking a divorce. She was a widow. I know I should feel something, she said to Thomas a week after it happened. They were sitting in the parlor of the boarding house, alone for the first time since that terrible night. Grief or regret or even relief, but I just feel numb. You feel however you need to feel, Thomas said gently. There is no right or wrong way to react. He was my husband for 6 years, and all I feel is glad that he is gone. What does that make me? It makes you human, Thomas said. He hurt you, Margaret, terrorized you. You do not owe him your grief. She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arms around her. They sat that way for a long time, finding comfort in each other's presence. With Ethan's death, the legal complications dissolved. Margaret was free, truly free, for the first time in years. But she and Thomas agreed to wait before marrying. It seemed improper to wed too soon after her husband's death, regardless of the circumstances. They wanted to do things properly, to give the town no more ammunition for gossip. They waited 6 months. In that time, Thomas sold his mountain cabin and used the money to buy a piece of land just outside Calistoga. He built a house there, not large but sturdy and well-made, with a wide porch and room for a garden. Margaret planted flowers and vegetables, delighting in having something that was truly hers to tend. They married in February of 1879, exactly 1 year after Thomas had found her in that snowdrift. Reverend Morse performed the ceremony in his church, and half the town turned out to witness it. Margaret wore a simple blue dress that matched her eyes, and Thomas wore his best suit. When they exchanged vows, both had tears in their eyes. I, Thomas Garrett, take you, Margaret Zimmerman, to be my wife, Thomas said, his voice strong and clear. I promise to love you, honor you, protect you, and cherish you for all the days of my life. I, Margaret Zimmerman, take you, Thomas Garrett, to be my husband, Margaret replied, her voice steady despite her tears. I promise to love you, stand beside you, trust you, and build a life with you for all the days of my life. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife and told Thomas he could kiss his bride, Thomas cupped Margaret's face in his hands and kissed her with all the love and tenderness he felt. The congregation erupted in applause. The reception was held at the hotel, and it seemed like everyone in Calistoga came to celebrate with them. Mrs. Patterson cried openly and hugged them both. Sheriff Dawson gave a toast about second chances and new beginnings. Even people who had once shunned them came forward to offer congratulations. That night, in the home Thomas had built for her, they made love for the first time as husband and wife. It was tender and sweet and passionate, everything Margaret had never known with Ethan, everything she had dreamed it could be. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, she traced her fingers over Thomas's face. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had not found me that day? She asked. I would have died in that snow, Thomas said honestly. Not physically, perhaps, but something in me was dying in that cabin, alone on that mountain. Finding you saved me as much as it saved you. We saved each other then, Margaret said softly. We saved each other, Thomas agreed. Life settled into a happy rhythm after that. Thomas continued to trap and hunt, though now he had help. Margaret proved to be an excellent shot and took to accompanying him on his trips into the mountains. They worked together, lived together, laughed together. The house Thomas had built became a true home, filled with warmth and love. In the fall of 1879, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and a little terror. Margaret had never carried a child before, and after everything she had been through, both worried about complications. But the pregnancy progressed smoothly, and in May of 1880, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Samuel, after Thomas's brother. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's remarkable hazel eyes, and from the moment Thomas held his son for the first time, he felt a love so fierce it almost frightened him. "He is perfect," Thomas whispered, staring down at the tiny face. "You are perfect." Margaret, exhausted but radiant, smiled up at him from the bed. "We made him together. Out of love, that is what makes him perfect." Samuel was followed by a daughter 2 years later, whom they named Elizabeth after Margaret's mother. Then another son, James, 2 years after that. The house that had seemed plenty large enough for two suddenly felt crowded and chaotic and absolutely wonderful. Thomas built an addition, adding 2 more bedrooms and a larger kitchen. The children grew up knowing nothing but love and security. They never saw their father raise his hand in anger, never heard their parents exchange harsh words. Thomas and Margaret were determined to give their children the childhood neither of them had truly had, one filled with laughter and safety and unconditional acceptance. As the years passed, Thomas and Margaret became pillars of the Calistoga community. They helped neighbors in need, attended church faithfully, hosted gatherings at their home. The whispers and gossip from those early days faded into memory, replaced by respect and genuine affection. Sheriff Dawson became a close friend, joining them for dinner at least once a month. Reverend Morse baptized each of their children and beamed with pride at having played a role in bringing their family together. Even Mrs. Hartwell, the lawyer, became part of their extended family, serving as godmother to Elizabeth. Thomas sometimes thought about that day in the blizzard, the choice he had made to stop and investigate what might have been just a snow-covered log. He thought about how easily he might have ridden past, how close Margaret had come to dying in that drift. The thought never failed to make him shudder and pull her closer. One winter evening in 1889, Thomas and Margaret sat together on their porch, wrapped in blankets against the cold. The children were inside, Samuel at 15 helping James with his arithmetic, while Elizabeth played with her dolls by the fire. It was peaceful and perfect, and Thomas felt a contentment so complete it brought tears to his eyes. "What are you thinking?" Margaret asked, noticing his expression. "I am thinking about the day I found you," Thomas admitted. "How different our lives might have been if I had ridden a different path that day." "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked. "Finding me brought you so much trouble, danger, gossip, legal bills." Thomas turned to look at her, this woman who had become the center of his world. Her hair was starting to show threads of silver now, and there were laugh lines around her eyes, but to him she was more beautiful than ever. "Regret," he said. "Margaret, finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me. You and these children, this life we have built together, it is more than I ever dreamed of having. More than I deserve." "You deserve everything good in this world," Margaret said fiercely. "You saved my life, Thomas. Not just that day in the snow, but every day since. You taught me what love really means, what a real partnership looks like. You gave me back myself. And you gave me a reason to live," Thomas said. "I was just existing before you, going through the motions. But you made me feel alive again." They kissed then, a slow, sweet kiss that still made Thomas's heart race even after 10 years of marriage. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. "Do you think we will have more children?" Margaret asked. Thomas laughed. "Are 3 not enough for you?" "I do not know," Margaret said thoughtfully. "I always imagined a big family. And we have room in that new addition. Let us see what God decides," Thomas said, pulling her close. "Whatever comes, we will face it together." As it turned out, God decided they would have two more children. Twin girls were born in 1890, bringing the Garrett household to 7 people and an amount of chaos that sometimes made Thomas laugh until he cried. But he would not have changed it for anything. The twins, Emily and Rose, were the babies of the family and utterly spoiled by their older siblings. Samuel grew into a fine young man who inherited his father's love of the mountains and his mother's sharp mind. He eventually became a forest ranger, protecting the wilderness that had once nearly claimed his mother's life. Elizabeth became a teacher, carrying on Reverend Morse's legacy of compassion and education. James took over his father's trapping business, expanding it into a successful trading post. As Thomas and Margaret grew older, they watched their children build their own lives and families. Samuel married a school teacher from Sacramento and had 4 children. Elizabeth married the new sheriff who had replaced Dawson when he retired and had 3. James married a rancher's daughter and had 5. The twins both stayed in Calistoga, Rose marrying the blacksmith and Emily marrying the doctor who had delivered her. Thomas and Margaret became grandparents many times over, their house always full of visiting children and grandchildren. They took pride in the family they had created, this sprawling network of love and connection that had started with one cowboy finding one woman in a snowdrift. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1904, their children threw them a celebration at the church hall. It seemed like the entire town showed up, spanning multiple generations. People gave speeches about Thomas and Margaret, about their love story and their generosity and their impact on Calistoga. Both of them sat at the head table, holding hands and occasionally wiping away tears. "When I married this woman," Thomas said when it was his turn to speak, "I thought I knew what love was. But every year since has taught me something new about it. Love is not just the exciting early days. It is the quiet mornings and the hard evenings. It is choosing each other every single day. It is building something together that is bigger than either of you alone." He turned to Margaret, who was crying openly now. "You are still the most beautiful thing I have ever seen, and I would ride through 1,000 blizzards to find you again." "I love you," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for stopping that day. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for this beautiful life." They kissed while the crowd cheered and applauded. Their children and grandchildren crowded around them, and Thomas felt a happiness so pure and complete that he sent up a silent prayer of gratitude. The years continued to pass. Thomas and Margaret grew old together, their hair going silver, their faces showing the marks of time and laughter and love. They slowed down but never stopped, still taking walks together, still sitting on their porch in the evenings, still holding hands like newlyweds. In 1912, Thomas fell ill with pneumonia. He was 71 years old, and though he fought hard, his body was tired. As he lay in bed with Margaret beside him, holding his hand just as she had so many times over the decades, he looked at her with eyes full of love. "I am not afraid," he told her. "I have had a good life, the best life, because of you." "Do not talk like that," Margaret said, though tears streamed down her face. "You are going to get better. You have to get better." "Margaret," he said gently, "it is all right. I am ready. But I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me you will keep living, keep being happy, keep being the amazing woman you are. Promise me you will not stop because I am gone." "Thomas," she sobbed, laying her head on his chest. "I do not know how to be without you." "Yes, you do," he said, stroking her hair with a weak hand. "You are the strongest person I know. You survived things that would have broken most people. You built a beautiful life from the ashes of tragedy. You will survive this too." "I love you," she whispered. "I love you so much." "And I love you," Thomas said. "I have loved you from the moment I saw you in that snow. I will love you forever." He died peacefully that night, with Margaret holding his hand and all their children gathered around the bed. The funeral was the largest Calistoga had ever seen, attended by hundreds of people whose lives Thomas had touched over the decades. He was buried in the church cemetery on a hill overlooking the valley he had called home. Margaret grieved deeply, but did not break. True to her promise to Thomas, she kept living. She spent time with her children and grandchildren, tended her garden, volunteered at the church. She never remarried, never even considered it. Thomas had been the love of her life, and that was enough. She lived another 15 years, long enough to see some of her grandchildren marry and have children of their own. Long enough to become a beloved matriarch, the grandmother everyone wanted to visit, who always had cookies and stories and unconditional love to offer. On a cold February morning in 1927, almost exactly 48 years after Thomas had found her in that snowdrift, Margaret Garrett passed away peacefully in her sleep. She was 83 years old. Her children found her in her bed, a peaceful expression on her face, and her hands stretched out across the empty pillow beside her, as if reaching for Thomas. She was buried next to her husband, their headstones side by side. The inscriptions were simple but perfect. Thomas's read, "Beloved husband and father. He saved her life and found his own." Margaret's read, "Beloved wife and mother. She was saved and became salvation." At the funeral, Samuel Garrett, now a gray-haired man of 48, with children and grandchildren of his own, stood to speak about his parents. He told the story they had all heard many times of the cowboy who found a woman dying in the snow and carried her home to safety, of how love had grown in the most unlikely circumstances, of how two broken people had healed each other and built something beautiful. "My parents taught me that love is not just a feeling," Samuel said, his voice strong despite his tears. "It is a choice, a commitment, an action. My father chose to stop that day when he could have kept writing. He chose to save a stranger. And every day after, he and my mother chose each other. They chose love. And because of that choice, all of us are here. Their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren. We are all here because one man saw someone in need and chose to help. Because two people chose to love each other despite all the obstacles in their way." He paused, looking out at the crowd of mourners that filled the church. That is their legacy. Not just us, their descendants, but the example they set, of kindness and courage and enduring love, of building something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy, of never giving up even when the world seems cold and cruel. Samuel's voice broke then, and he had to pause to collect himself. "I miss them both so much, but I am grateful. Grateful for the time we had with them. Grateful for the love they shared with each other and with us. Grateful for the lessons they taught. And I know that wherever they are now, they are together, just as they always were." The congregation said their amens, and then they sang Margaret's favorite hymn, the one about grace and redemption. As the voices rose in the small church, it felt like Thomas and Margaret were there too, their spirits lingering to hear the love and gratitude of the family they had created. After the funeral, the family gathered at the house Thomas had built all those years ago. It belonged to James now, who had maintained it lovingly, keeping it much as it had been when his parents lived there. The porch where Thomas and Margaret had spent so many evenings still stood strong. The garden Margaret had tended still bloomed each spring. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren played in the yard while the adults sat on that same porch, sharing memories and stories. Someone told the one about the time Thomas had tried to teach Margaret to fish and she had fallen in the creek. Someone else remembered the Christmas when Thomas had dressed as St. Nicholas for all the neighborhood children. Another recalled Margaret's famous apple pie and how she had always made extra for anyone who needed it. As the sun set over the valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Samuel stood and raised his glass of cider. "To Thomas and Margaret Garrett," he said, "may we all be lucky enough to find a love like theirs. May we all have the courage to choose it, fight for it, and cherish it the way they did." To Thomas and Margaret, everyone echoed, raising their glasses. In the years that followed, The story of Thomas and Margaret Garrett became something of a local legend in Calistoga. Parents told it to their children, who told it to their children. It became a story about hope and love and second chances, about the power of one choice, one act of kindness, to change everything. The house Thomas built stood for generations, eventually being designated a historical site. A plaque was placed on the property, telling the story of the cowboy who found his wife in a snowdrift and the life they built together. Tourists came to see it, drawn by the romance of the tale. But for those who were descended from Thomas and Margaret Garrett, it was more than just a story. It was their legacy. It was in the way they loved their own spouses, choosing them every day the way their ancestor had. It was in the way they helped strangers, remembering that one act of kindness had created their entire family. It was in the way they faced hardships, drawing strength from the knowledge that Thomas and Margaret had overcome so much more. On cold February mornings, when snow fell on the California mountains, some swore they could see two figures walking hand in hand through the drifts, a tall cowboy and a woman with remarkable hazel eyes, neither young nor old, just eternally together. It was probably just a trick of the light, just imagination fueled by a beloved story. But maybe, just maybe, it was something more. Maybe it was proof that some loves really do last forever, that some choices echo through generations, that sometimes when a cowboy stops to help a stranger in the snow, he finds not just someone to save, but someone to save him in return. And maybe that is the truest definition of love there is, not just romance or passion or even commitment, though those things matter, but the willingness to stop when you could keep going, to help when it would be easier to turn away, to choose another person every single day, even when it is hard. Thomas and Margaret Garrett did that. They chose each other in the face of violence and gossip and legal battles and every obstacle the world threw at them. They built a life together that outlasted them both, rippling out through time in the lives of their descendants and in the story that would be told for generations. It started with one cowboy, one frozen woman, and one choice to stop. And from that single moment came a love story that would never die, a legacy that would never fade, and a family that would carry their memory forward forever. That is how love changes the world, not in grand gestures or dramatic declarations, though those have their place, but in the quiet choice to care, to stop, to stay, to build something beautiful with another person, brick by brick, day by day, year by year. Thomas Garrett found Margaret Zimmerman unconscious in a snowdrift on a February day in 1878. He carried her home and prayed she would wake. She did wake. And together they built a life, raised a family, and created a love story for the ages. It was not always easy. It was sometimes dangerous and often difficult, but it was always worth it, because at the end of all their days, when they looked back on the life they had shared, they could say with absolute certainty that they had been blessed, that they had been lucky, that they had found something rare and precious and worth fighting for. They had found each other, and that made all the difference.